Aperion Cyberstorm is a new twin-stick shooter out for the Switch, Wii U, and PC today, with an Xbox One version coming sometime later this year. Experience a story filled with secrets and revelations as you shoot down enemies with your variety of ships and weapon upgrades. It's a very chaotic and at times thrilling party game. Aperion Cyberstorm's story stars you, a member in a squad who gets separated from the rest of the squad during an invasion attack. However, as you pick yourself up and trace back the sequence of events, you start to realize that things may not be as they seem. Travel from planet to planet as you find new puzzle pieces as to what's going on and slowly reveal the truth behind everything. It's an interesting story that got more interesting in the later half of the game than in the intro. The start of it felt rather slow, and I think that's in part to how the story was presented. As you're playing through a mission, dialogue prompts will show up on screen and it sort of interrupts the gameplay. You can still move around and shoot in the background, but the gameplay itself will not progress unless you press the A button and continue the prompt. It's almost like a pseudo pause button. It sort of kills the immersion of the story, and I had a similar issue with the recent Dragon Ball FighterZ game I reviewed. The worst part is that since there isn't any voice acting, you have to read everything, so you do actually have to stop flying around and pause to read out the conversation. I feel like the story would have flowed better if it took the same approach that Star Fox 64 did. Have the prompts be read out loud and timed where they flow automatically rather than taking the player out of the moment to read the dialogue. It's a decent minimal backdrop story for the gameplay, I just think it could have been presented better. Aperion Cyberstorm has a mix of different game modes that all feature some sort of optional multiplayer content. The campaign is broken up into 4 planets, each with levels that took me roughly 15 to 20 minutes to complete. Each level has you explore a segment of rooms as you go from point A to point B. You can think of it as a labyrinth setup like Binding of Isaac, just not randomized and pretty straightforward. As you travel from room to room, you'll encounter rounds of enemies that you'll have to destroy before progressing onto the next room. At the top right, you'll see a brief outline of how rooms will look like, but you won't actually know what's inside of each room until you actually enter it. Whether it's a room with a bunch of enemies in it or a room that you just go right through it. Jumping into a campaign, you're able to play with a total of 5 players local co-op. The game gives you a few options to customize your ship and make it a bit easier to identify your ship on screen. You give your ship a 3-letter tag along with a primary color, and that's pretty much all the cosmetic stuff. The real fun in customization comes through the choice in your ship, each with their own unique stats and abilities that you can attach to them. The abilities help out the player through boosting different parts of the ship, for example adding a rapid fire, a spread shot, or a shield on the ship. You can have a total of 2 abilities attached at once, and each one is upgradable using the crystal currency you collect by destroying crystals on the walls of levels. Those upgrades usually increase the duration of the ability while lowering the cooldown time. Ships and abilities can be found usually at the end of a level where a checkpoint is, or hidden somewhere in the middle of a level. Those new upgrades and ships can be swapped out during checkpoints. I constantly found myself switching between different ships and trying out new combinations of weapons to see which playstyle suited me the best. Controls for the game were pretty straightforward. I played on the Switch for most of my review. You control the movement with the left analog stick and the fire rate with the right stick. It's a pretty traditional twin stick setup. You perform a short boost or tackle with the press of a shoulder button, and each ability is attached to one of the triggers on the controller. Much like the story, I found the early levels of the game to be pretty slow and rather boring. I was playing on the medium or regular difficulty, and there were times where I was actually just closing my eyes, still surviving and winning fights against enemies. It wasn't until the first boss fight for the first world that the game started to crank up a bit more and got more fun. As I moved from planet to planet, the terrains would change, new enemies that weren't there before started to appear, and the game started to get a bit more entertaining. With that said, the game never felt like it had something unique to offer in the genre, it was just alright at its peak. Luckily, this game still has a few redeeming qualities in its competitive multiplayer modes, and I think that's where the charm of this game really does come in. Onslaught is a survival mode that can play with up to 5 players against waves and waves of enemies that get progressively more difficult with each wave. You can play on a series of arena maps that come from the campaign mode. When starting an Onslaught game, you'll find abilities spawning randomly across the map as they act as temporary power-ups that help you clear out waves. At first they seem pretty overpowered, but after a few rounds you'll realize that they're only there to soften up the challenge awaiting for you at the end. At the end of each run, you'll start to earn stars for surviving, and in return you can use those stars to unlock new maps to play on. This was way more entertaining than the campaign mode, and by far my favorite mode in the game. The other half of the multiplayer mode is the versus mode, and boy, there's a variety of games for you to play. There's traditional versus game modes that have you play against other players for gaining the most points or surviving the most. One game mode resembles King of the Hill from Halo, where you have to get the most amount of points by controlling a certain point on the map, for as long as you can. Each mode is customizable with a point and time limit, as well as being able to set teams or play individually. The versus mode was pretty fun in groups of 2 or 3, but anything more than that became pretty chaotic and very hard to see what the hell was going on. Aperion Cyberstorm isn't the prettiest looking game, it's extremely simple in visual design. Backgrounds are usually just solid colors, with enemies consisting of floating sprites that change in colors to differentiate themselves. The terrain tends to stand out the most as they look incredibly plain, and it's what you have to look at all the time. When the explosions and firefights go off in modes like Onslaught or Versus, the game can look quite vibrant and colorful, and those are the moments in the game that look the best. However, 90% of this game is just very plain looking. While playing on the Nintendo Switch, mostly everything is scaled down well on the display except for the text. Certain dialogue prompts could be a bit hard to read on the Switch in handheld mode, but you can easily fix the issue in the options menu and increase the font size. The music and audio design in this game is just as simple as the visuals. A lot of the songs in this game are just short loop techno tracks, and some better than others, but the majority being rather boring. There were points in the game where I could quite specifically tell a music track would loop because there was a pause in the game that stood out. Sound effects aren't really anything to write home about either. Everything from the dings upon collecting currency to the old school asteroid explosion sound effects that play when the enemy blows up. It all sounds very generic, like it was taken from a public sound effect bank. On the bright side, there is some decent use of the HC rumble that has vibrations mapped to the fire of the weapon along with the destruction of enemy ships. It's ever so subtle, but nice. Aperion Cyberstorm is just an okay game where I really liked one half of the game that was mostly multiplayer and competitive based, but the other half was incredibly boring. I was partially intrigued by the story, but it was presented in a way where I only lost interest over time, and that only got worse with the presentation of the visuals and the audio. The gameplay in the campaign started off incredibly easy and boring. It did get better over time, but it never really felt like it was anything unique or special in the genre. It was just okay. However, playing through Onslaught really turned the game around for me. It was fun and pretty addicting to play with friends on the couch. The insane powerful abilities were chaotic but fun to mix and match with against enemies. That leaves me somewhere in the middle where I do think a fraction of this game is worth playing while the rest of it is incredibly boring. If you can get the game on a hefty sell, I think it's a worthy pickup just for the multiplayer and the survival stuff. It's currently on sale for $15 and it's 10% off for the first week of release. That does it for my review of Aperion Cyberstorm for the Nintendo Switch, Wii U, and PC, and keep in mind it is coming out to the Xbox One sometime later this year. If you do have any questions about the game or the review, feel free to ask me though in the comment section down below, or just hit me up on Snapchat, Twitter, or Instagram. Those links are in the description down below. If you enjoyed this review, then please consider dropping a like and subscribe for more reviews just like this. I do my best to try to cover all the big AAA stuff, but also all the small indie stuff that gets down through the radar too. As always, thank you all very much for watching, hope you guys have a great day, and I'll see you all in the next one.